The rain had been falling since morning, not the fierce, howling kind that rattles windows, but the slow, steady kind that seeps into your bones and makes the world feel quieter than it should. Inside the small apartment, the air was still. The only sound was the faint hum of the radiator and the rhythmic tapping of rain against the glass. Dust floated lazily in the muted light, filtering through half-drawn curtains. It was the kind of afternoon where memories seemed to breathe in the silence. On the desk sat a wooden drawer. I was looking for something else entirely when my hand brushed against an envelope wedged in the back corner. It was sealed. The paper was yellowed at the edges, the handwriting on the front faint but unmistakable. My fingers hesitated before touching it, as if some part of me already knew the weight it carried. There was no stamp, no address, just a name. I don't know what made me sit down before I opened it. Maybe the way the ink had smudged in places, as though written by a hand that trembled, or by someone who had already decided these words would never be sent. The rain outside deepened its rhythm, like a steady drumbeat to the memories unspooling in my mind. I had loved once, the kind of love you don't plan for, the kind that crashes into your life uninvited and makes a home in places you didn't know were empty. But love, I learned, isn't always enough. Sometimes it's eroded by choices, and sometimes by the silence after them. This letter, this fragile, unspoken confession, was the last remnant of a story that never reached its ending. Because the ending came long before the words could. And as I turned the envelope over in my hands, I realized something. Some stories don't fade with time. They just wait quietly for someone to open them. The bell above the cafe door gave a soft chime as I stepped inside, shaking off the rain from my coat. The warmth hit me first, a gentle embrace after the damp chill outside. The smell followed, rich coffee beans, a hint of vanilla, and the faintest trace of cinnamon drifting from the counter. The place was small, tucked away on a side street, where time seemed to slow. Wooden tables, mismatched chairs, and walls lined with black and white photographs of strangers who had once sat where I was now standing. In the far corner, a window looked out onto the street, raindrops racing each other down the glass. That's where I saw him. He was sitting alone. A half-empty mug in front of him, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim. His gaze was on the rain, but his eyes, they looked like someone else's thoughts were miles away. Something in that quiet expression pulled at me. Not curiosity exactly, but recognition. The cafe was almost full, and the only empty seat was at his table. I hesitated, feeling that polite hesitation we all have when faced with a stranger. But when he glanced up and our eyes met, he gave the smallest nod, a silent permission. I sat for a moment. Neither of us spoke. The rain filled the silence, a soft percussion against the glass. Then he said, "They say the smell of coffee is stronger in the rain. Maybe that's why this place always feels warmer on days like this." His voice was low, thoughtful. I smiled without meaning to. Or maybe it's the kind of day where people need warmth more, so they imagine it. A faint laugh escaped him, quick but genuine. That was the first spark. Not loud or dramatic, but subtle. The kind that makes you lean in without realizing you've done it. We talked cautiously at first. Names the weather, how neither of us had planned to be here but ended up finding shelter from the same storm. Slowly, the words grew heavier, not in weight, but in meaning. He spoke of living in a city where you could be surrounded by people and still feel invisible. I told him about nights when silence felt louder than noise. It was strange how quickly we understood each other, as if our loneliness spoke the same language. Outside, the rain didn't let up. Inside, the space between us seemed to shrink with every passing minute. I noticed the way his eyes lit briefly when he spoke about the books he loved. The way his hands moved as if trying to shape his thoughts in the air. By the time my coffee was gone, I knew I should leave, but I didn't want to. Neither did he. When the storm finally softened, I stood reluctantly, pulling my coat tighter. He looked at me, the faintest question in his eyes. "Maybe," I said, "we'll run into each other again." And as I stepped back into the damp, glistening street, I had no idea that this quiet afternoon was the beginning of everything. It started with a note tucked inside a book, a week after that rainy afternoon. I found it a slim paperback I had borrowed from the cafe's small shelf, pages still faintly smelling of coffee. Between chapter 5 and 6, a folded piece of cream paper waited, edges softened, as if it had been held too long before being placed there. The handwriting was precise, deliberate, You left before I could ask your name. If you ever find this, meet me at the same table." I smiled in spite of myself. No name, no number, just a place. From then on, the letters became our language. Slipped into books, folded into coat pockets, left beneath mugs when one of us had to leave early. They weren't long. A few lines, a thought captured like a photograph. "You look like someone who reads the ending first. I saw a couple dancing in the rain today. Thought of you. The world feels quieter when you're in it." And always no signatures. We didn't need them. Nights were for the phone. Not constant calls, but the kind that began after midnight, when the city had gone to sleep and there was no one to overhear. We spoke about everything and nothing. Childhood dreams, songs that could still make us cry, the strange comfort of knowing someone's breathing on the other end. It felt unhurried, intimate in a way that wasn't about touch, but about being seen. He gave me a fountain pen one evening, its weight balanced perfectly in my hand. "For your words," he said, as though they deserved something better than cheap ink. I gave him a pressed flower between the pages of a book he loved, The Great Gatsby, the petals already fading to a softer hue. We began to weave ourselves into each other's days. I could spot his handwriting from across a room. He could tell when I was tired, just by the pause before I answered the phone. But there were moments, small, quiet ones, when something shifted, like the night I called, and his voice was warm but distant, as though part of him was already somewhere else. Or the letter that ended with "Some stories end before they begin." A line I didn't understand then, but would carry with me for years. Still, I didn't ask. And he didn't explain. The notes kept coming. The calls continued. And whatever truth lingered between his words, I chose to believe that some things were better left unread. The first time I stepped into his apartment, the rain had followed me. It clung to my coat, dripped from my hair, and pooled at the edge of his welcome mat. He smiled, that half-smile he always wore when he was trying to hide nerves, and took my coat, brushing his fingers against mine a little longer than necessary. The place was small, but warm in a way that didn't feel staged, the kind of warmth that came from use, from someone who cooked in their kitchen, read on their couch, left shoes by the door. The living room was bathed in late afternoon light, the kind that makes dust dance in the air like tiny, suspended stars. A faint smell of cedar drifted from somewhere, maybe the old bookshelf standing proudly against the wall. Its wood slightly uneven, as if it had been moved from place to place over the years. He made tea. I wandered. There was a record player in the corner, stacked beside an uneven tower of vinyls, a wool blanket draped over the couch, a few pages of handwritten notes scattered across the coffee table. It was cozy, lived in. But then, my eyes found the mantel. It wasn't much, just a narrow shelf above the small fireplace, holding a few objects. A candle melted to an odd shape, a ceramic bowl, its glaze cracked with age. And, leaning casually against the wall, a photograph. It was a woman. Smiling, caught mid-laugh. Her hand rested on someone's shoulder, but the edge of the frame cut him out. There was something intimate in that smile. Something claimed I felt the smallest pull in my stomach. Before I could study it longer, he returned with the tea. I turned back toward the couch, pretending to admire the blanket instead. We drank in quiet conversation. He told me about the building's history, about the neighbor upstairs who played the violin late at night. We laughed, really laughed, when he described the time. He burned an entire tray of muffins and set off the fire alarm for the whole street. For a while, I forgot the photograph, until he asked me to grab a spoon from the kitchen. The drawer stuck slightly before opening. Inside was the usual cutlery, a stray pen, a torn packet of sugar, and, tucked in the corner, a small velvet box. I didn't open it. I didn't have to. When I returned with the spoon, he didn't notice the extra second it had taken me. Or maybe he did, but chose not to say anything. We ate, we laughed again, and he walked me to the door as if everything was untouched. Unchanged.com. But on the way out, I glanced once more at the mantel. The photograph hadn't moved. Her smile hadn't changed. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just met the ghost of someone still very much alive. The invitation had been sitting on his desk for weeks, the edges curling slightly where the paper met the air. I'd seen it, run my fingers over the embossed letters, and imagined an evening of shared glances, whispered jokes, and the kind of comfort that comes from standing together in a crowded room. The night of the event, the city seemed to hum with winter's breath. I wore the dress he said he liked, soft blue, understated, the kind of dress that didn't try to compete, only hoped to belong. We arrived late. The ballroom was already alive with warm laughter and the delicate chime of glasses. Crystal chandeliers spilled gold over polished wood, casting reflections that trembled with every movement of the crowd. And that's when I saw her, the woman in red. It was the sort of dress that didn't just enter a room, it claimed it, deep velvet red that clung and flowed all at once, catching the light like liquid fire. She moved through the crowd with quiet assurance. Her smile small but certain, as if she already knew the conversations she would command. And him, I caught it, that fraction of a second when his eyes found her. He didn't move toward her, not yet, but something in his shoulders shifted. The way a man unconsciously prepares for a familiar presence, introductions were made eventually. Her handshake was warm, her perfume a subtle echo of something expensive and hard to place. Her eyes held mine just long enough to suggest a conversation we weren't having. The three of us stood together for a while, their laughter easy, mine a half-step behind. Words floated around me, but the undercurrent was in the spaces between them. The subtle tilt of his head toward her, the way she touched his sleeve when making a point, the history that lived in the ease of their exchange. I found myself watching from a distance, even while standing right there. Dinner was served. I sat across from them, the long table, an elegant disguise for separation. Between the flicker of candlelight and the soft clink of cutlery, I studied the two of them like strangers in a photograph, their silhouettes leaning closer with each course, her laughter spilling across the linen, his smile tugging in ways it hadn't in weeks. I told myself I was imagining it, that the red was just a color, the touch just politeness, the laughter just polite noise. But somewhere deep in my chest, something small and certain began to shift. By the time dessert arrived, I realized I had barely touched my plate. My spoon sat untouched beside a dish of melting cream. Across the table, he was listening to her, really listening, the rest of the room fading for him the way it once had for me. And in that moment, it struck me not like lightning, but like the slow closing of a door, that I might already be an outsider in my own love story. It began with the sound of his voice, not the tone he used with me, softer, warmer, but something lower, almost conspiratorial. I had been on my way to find him, a book in one hand, a half-formed question in my mind when I heard it. The hallway outside the guest rooms was dim, the old sconces casting lazy pools of light along the wallpaper. I slowed my steps without meaning to, the carpet swallowing my footfalls until I was standing just shy of the slightly ajar door. I can't just... His voice trailed off, swallowed by the crackle of something, maybe laughter, maybe static on a phone line. A second voice followed, a woman's low and threaded with a calm certainty that made my stomach tighten. I couldn't make out the words, only the rise and fall. The familiar cadence of two people who didn't need to explain much to each other. I told myself to knock, to walk in, to end the quiet ache building behind my ribs. But instead, I stood there, staring at the strip of light spilling across the floor, feeling like an intruder in my own life. He laughed then, not loud, but the kind of laugh that carried weight. I felt it before I understood it, the echo of something I'd once thought belonged to me alone. I backed away before the conversation ended, retreating into the muted hum of the house. That night, I lay awake. The ceiling a canvas for all the questions I didn't dare ask. I tried to recall the exact sound of her voice, to decide whether it was even her. Maybe it was a work call. Maybe I was inventing shadows in well-lit rooms. Days passed, but the pattern continued. A closed door here, a lowered voice there. I would walk into a room just as a conversation ended, his phone slipping into his pocket, his smile arriving a fraction too late. Once in the early hours, when rain pressed against the windows, I heard him pacing in the study. The muffled rhythm of his words reached me through the thin wall, and though I strained to catch them, they dissolved into the static of my own heartbeat. The inner battle was relentless. On one side, love. Not the fluttering early kind, but the steady anchor I had built my life around. The man who made me coffee without asking, who tucked the blanket around my shoulders on late movie nights, who once looked at me as though the rest of the world didn't exist. On the other, doubt quiet at first, then louder, a persistent whisper that this wasn't just in my head, that something had shifted, that maybe it had been shifting for longer than I realized. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Perhaps I wasn't ready for answers. Perhaps I feared that in asking, I would turn the unspoken into something permanent, something I couldn't fold neatly away. Instead, I began to notice everything. The way he checked the time more often. The way his gaze sometimes drifted, not to me, but to some thought far away. And the way, when he closed a door behind him, I was left staring at the wood, wondering what truth might be breathing quietly on the other side. It was long past midnight when I found myself at the desk, the lamp casting a small circle of light over a blank sheet of paper. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper, as though even the storm had grown tired. I hadn't planned to write. My hands were restless, my chest too heavy, and words, the ones I had bitten back for weeks, began pressing against my ribs. The pen hovered for a moment before touching the page. "I don't know when we stopped speaking the same language," I wrote. "I only know that I still hear your voice in my head, but it's not speaking to me anymore." The ink moved faster than my thoughts. Every sentence felt like a small act of surrender. I told him I missed the days when our laughter filled rooms, when his eyes sought mine across crowded spaces like we were sharing some private joke. I confessed that lately I'd felt like a guest in his life, welcomed but not truly known. I didn't accuse him. I didn't name the shadows that had been lingering at the edges of our days. Instead, I wrote of the small things I loved, the way he absent-mindedly tapped his fingers when he was thinking, the way he paused before turning a page as though considering the weight of the words. I wrote them down because I needed him to know that love had been here, stubborn and unshaken. Even as doubt crept in, the hardest line came near the end. "If you ever loved me in the way I loved you, I hope you remember it without pain." When I set the pen down, the silence of the room pressed in around me. My eyes burned, though no tears fell. I read the letter twice, once as myself, and once as though I were him. Searching for the truth beneath each line, it was not a letter that could be sent, not because it was cruel, but because it was too honest, too final. Sending it would be crossing a threshold I wasn't sure I was ready for, so I folded it carefully, as though the act might keep its contents from spilling out into the world. I slid it into an envelope, the paper whispering against paper, and sealed it without an address. I didn't hide it far, just deep enough in the drawer of the writing desk that it wouldn't be found unless someone went looking. A part of me hoped no one ever would. Another part, the quieter, braver part, hoped someday it might be discovered. And in that moment, everything I hadn't been able to say out loud would finally be heard. I blew out the lamp, the darkness folding over the room like a curtain. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the air damp and still in the silence. I felt the faintest shift inside me, the knowledge that I had written the ending, even if I hadn't yet spoken it aloud. The letter waited in the dark. And with it, so did the truth. The sky had that same bruised color it wore the afternoon. We met a deep, restless gray, heavy with unfallen rain. I wasn't expecting to see him there. The street was nearly empty, the air carrying that charged stillness that comes just before a storm breaks. He was standing by the corner, hands in his coat pockets, head tilted down as though studying the cracks in the pavement. When he looked up, there was no surprise in his face, almost as if he'd been waiting. We didn't greet each other. The distance between us was small enough to cross in 3 steps, but we both stayed where we were, letting the rain begin to fall in thin, cold threads. For a moment, it felt like we had slipped back in time, back to that cafe, to warm coffee and awkward laughter, to the feeling that we were the only 2 people who existed in the world. But this time, there was no comfort in the quiet, only a heaviness neither of us could lift. He opened his mouth, as if to speak, but the words never came. I wondered if they were the same ones that had sat unsent in my drawer for months, the ones that could end us, or maybe save us, but only if spoken too late. The rain thickened, painting his coat darker, flattening my hair against my cheeks. Somewhere nearby, a car passed through a puddle, sending ripples across the silence. But we didn't move. Our eyes met one last time. I searched for something: apology, explanation, even anger, but all I found was that quiet resignation that comes when 2 people have already said goodbye. Just not out loud.com. Finally, he shifted his weight, and I knew it was over. Without a word, we stepped in opposite directions, him toward the station, me toward the narrow street that would take me home. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Behind me, the rain fell harder, blurring the outlines of the world. And in that soft, steady downpour, it felt like the sky was doing the crying for both of us. Somewhere, deep in a drawer, the letter still waited, sealed, unread, and now forever unsent. The rain has stopped now. The streets outside are slick and glistening, catching the glow of the street lamps like fragments of shattered glass. I sit at the same desk where I found it, the letter still sealed, its edges slightly frayed with age. My thumb traces the crease where it had been folded, the faint indentation of the handwriting visible through the envelope. I've imagined what it says 100 times. A confession, an apology, a truth too sharp to speak out loud. Or maybe, just 3 words that were meant to come too late, but I'll never open it. I've told myself it's because some things are better left as they are, untouched, unruined by the reality of what they contain. The truth is, I'm afraid. Afraid that whatever's inside will prove what I already know, or undo the fragile peace I've built in its absence. Timing is a fragile thing in love. 1 heartbeat too soon, and the moment shatters. 1 heartbeat too late, and it slips away entirely. Some loves end loudly with shouting, tears, doors slammed in anger. But ours ended in silence, and silence has a way of staying. I slide the letter back into the drawer, the wood closing with a muted click. Outside, the world has moved on, as it always does. But here, in the quiet, I can still feel the weight of that rain-soaked afternoon. I can still see him walking away, and I know some silences never fade.